Hey folks, so Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and we've got Zach Evans from Destrier. So you've hopefully seen Zach before on my channel, or probably you've seen him on his own channel as well, which will be linked below. So we're having a really fun day today down at some stables near Windsor, in England of course, and we're here talking today about horses, jousting, mounted combat versus foot combat, particularly cavalry versus infantry, and that's what is going to be the focus of this video. We're also going to be looking at armour today and various other things as well. So the main topic for this specific video is Zach and I are going to be looking at some theoretical and practical aspects of advice for the infantryman against the cavalryman. Now, clearly you guys know that I can't ride a horse, but Zach can. So Zach's going to be playing the part pretty much of the cavalryman and talking about that side of things. And there's going to be a second part to this video. So this is a two-part extravaganza for your pleasure, part one, part two. This part one is going to be mostly looking at my perspective and my advice and observations for the footman against the cavalryman with various weapons in a mostly medieval context. We might touch on other periods, but mostly medieval. And then the second part, Zach's going to be leading, and it's going to be looking at it from the cavalryman's perspective. So first up, Zach, tell us a little bit about your experience and what it is you do.
So I do jousting. It's modern jousting, so we are jousting for real. There are certain things that aren't exactly the same. The coronal on the end of the lance isn't sharpened steel, for example. So I've got kind of a background in sporting, horse riding from that point of view. I've been reenacting for more than half my life now, which is longer than I imagine it is to be. And so on foot, and I've been riding for most of that time. I'm certainly not the best rider. I'm not the best HEMA practitioner, but I've got a real interest in the history and looking at it from a global perspective.
Yeah, and one of the things is, and this isn't true of all people jousting out there, is that Zach actually looks at the sources. You know, he looks at what Talhofer shows being done with the lance, which we were looking at just before filming this, and that kind of stuff. So it's great because Zach comes at this from a very HEMA perspective, looking at the source material, but then practically doing it on a horse. And Zach spends loads of time on a horse, so very well qualified for this particular topic. And obviously I'm not the most gifted HEMA practitioner on foot in the world, but I've got enough experience to be able to bring something useful hopefully to this topic. Yeah. I think one of the first things we should mention is that a lot of people, particularly on the internet, like to make these sorts of comparisons very black and white, yeah, and very like, oh, the person on foot's obviously going to win, or oh, the knight on horseback's obviously going to win. And it's not as simple as that ever, is it? So, you know, we simply wouldn't be making this video, we wouldn't be discussing this topic, and perhaps more importantly, treatises and manuals from centuries gone by wouldn't discuss this topic if it was a foregone conclusion. If the outcome was guaranteed, then we wouldn't bother talking about it. It depends on a huge range of factors, doesn't it?
We oversimplify history a lot to fit it into history books. And, you know, to a certain extent that's unavoidable because all of life is in history, and you can't fit all of life into a book. So,
no.
You know.
And everyone's experiences are different.
Yeah.
And there are so many parameters here. And that's the second point I want to hit on, is that this is a one-on-one encounter. Okay, so we're not looking at a group of infantry like pikemen. We're not looking at a squadron of cavalry or anything like that. We're looking at what happens when one medieval horseman comes up against one medieval footman. Now, even within that limited scenario, there are many parameters. There's differences of the horse, the type of horse, the size of the horse, the nature of the horse. There's differences in armour. Is the horseman fully armoured, partially armoured? We're going to assume for this that it's an armoured knight or man-at-arms. And then there's the infantryman. What's the infantryman armed with? Is he armed with a spear, a pike, a bill or halberd, or perhaps just a sword and shield? And we're going to look at some of those variations. Also, what's the horseman armed with? Is the horseman armed with a lance, or has the lance already been used and now he's down to his sword? So obviously there's a huge number of variables, aren't there? And we're going to try and look at a few of those common variables, the most common ones, within the course of this video, and try and hit on what we think are some of the main aspects of the fight between the medieval infantryman and the medieval cavalryman.
Yeah, and if there's anything that we don't explain, which is very, very likely we're going to miss something, do leave questions, and this is something that we're really enjoying so far. It would be great to revisit it in a further video.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. We don't live far apart at all, and we can absolutely do follow-up videos to this one if there's specific things, you know, what happens if the mounted man is unarmoured or has a particular type of weapon, or the footman has a particular type of weapon, or is backed up against an obstruction of some kind and can't move around so much. You know, whatever you can think of, we can potentially look at it in future videos.
Yeah.
So, without any more ado, let's go into some of the main aspects of advice, essentially, the footman against the cavalryman. So, first up, to set the scene, the horseman in this case, assume that Zach is armoured, okay? He's an armoured knight or man-at-arms, and the two weapons that we're going to be looking at in the course of this video will either be a lance or a sword, and he is wearing a sword on his side there. And these are the two principal weapons of the mounted man-at-arms, of course. The lance is the primary weapon, the sword is usually the secondary weapon. Of course, the lance can at some point become expended, it can become broken, it could become embedded in an enemy target, or it could simply be dropped or lost. Or in another situation, Zach might choose to drop the lance because in that particular scenario, in a melee, the sword might be a more useful weapon. It depends what he's doing. Two different tools for different jobs. For the infantryman, in that case, that's me. I'm the one not on the horse here. We're going to be looking essentially at pole weapons or a short weapon and a shield. So, for example, if we went to Fiore, then we're looking at something like a winged spear. So principally a thrusting weapon that has some cutting capacity, in this case with lugs on it. Whether they're important or not, that's a fairly minor detail, but they can encounter the lance or indeed sword in different ways than a simple spear can. So essentially things like partisans, those types of cut and thrust spears. We're also going to look at the longer type of spear, not pike length, but something that's more of a typical spear length. So something that's maybe about 10 feet long. So we've essentially got shorter spears, which sometimes can cut, longer spears, which usually can just poke. Then we're also going to look at if there's any real change for particularly short pole weapons. So two-handed swords, pole axes, certain types of glaive, things like this, of this kind of length. And then finally, we are going to look at the question of the shield, which could be of various sorts, but I've picked a fairly typical heater shield, and a short weapon, be it a warhammer, mace, or perhaps even a one-handed sword, and how those things change the encounter between the horseman and the person on foot. So the other thing we should mention pretty much near the beginning of this is, obviously this is a beautiful horse and we're being very careful and we're not going to do anything which would possibly harm this horse. However, historically, in a battlefield situation, if that person up there is trying to kill me, then my ideas about wounding or offending this unit that's trying to attack me does include the horse. And we have to mention that for historical accuracy and because the sources that we work with mention it. So indeed, they would have used their swords or pole weapons, pole axes, spears, whatever. They would have used it equally against the horse and the man. But obviously we're not going to be simulating that exactly here, but we will talk about it. I understand that some people might find that unpalatable because it's a beautiful horse and we don't like to think about hurting them. But obviously it's a part of the combat that would have happened historically, and it's an important part to recognise. Now, also on that note, I would say something that was very interesting to me already is when you're on foot facing someone with a weapon on a horse's back, this is dangerous to you and that's dangerous to you, and in a sense that gives you two things to think about, and it's not something that I'd necessarily sort of so explicitly understood until I was actually moving around with Zach and he was riding around me with a lance and a sword on horseback, that you as a footman have to keep your eye on what both that horse is doing and what that horseman is doing. So it's you're kind of fighting against two people rather than just one. It's very, very interesting.
The horse armour often had spikes as well. So he's just been nuzzling you, but there could have been an extra point to
absolutely. So a chanfron on the head. They often put sort of unicorn spike on there, didn't they? And they would sometimes have pointed projections down over the nose as well. And indeed, you know, any barding on the front of the horse might have projections on it. So indeed, that's another thing that's worth mentioning, is that in some situations where a source might say, well, you know, you maybe stab the horse as when covering from the blow from the person's head, that might not be possible if the horse has got barding on it. And we know there were certain battles during the 100 Years' War where longbows didn't have their usual effect because the Italian horses were wearing steel barding. So indeed, this can be armoured and the man can be armoured as well. Even if it's just a cloth caparison as well, so from an earlier period, that can provide some degree of protection at least, maybe not so much against stabbing, but certainly against incidental cutting and things like that. And it does mean that often you can't get access to the underside of the horse if that's something you wanted to do, because of that hanging down there as well. So indeed, this horse can be protected in ways beyond what's shown here. Okay, so the very first piece of advice for the footman or infantryman here is about positioning. Now, clearly nothing is symmetrical in an engagement. I'm a right-handed person, so if I'm holding a poleaxe, my right hand is going to be at the top of the weapon most of the time and the left hand is going to be at the bottom. Equally, Zach in this case is also a right-handed person, so his weapon is going to be on that side. But what weapon he's holding also dictates which side of this horse is the most dangerous for me to be on, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail when we look at the weapon specifics. But the first thing to mention is that if this horse is, whether it's manoeuvring around me or coming straight at me, where I position myself is majorly important, and what he's armed with and what I'm armed with dictates where I want to be. Okay, so for example, if I am armed with any kind of weapon, in fact, and Zach is armed with a lance, if you just hold the lance pointing towards me for now, you will notice that Zach can track me a long way around on this side. But on this side of the horse, whilst he can track me, he gets to a point where he gets mechanically weaker, and it gets to a point where he has to switch or move the lance to continue tracking me around here. So there is an asymmetry here, and not to say that he can't, as Zach showed there, not to say that he's got a total blind spot, or there are things that he just can't adapt to or change to kind of match what I'm doing. But the fact is that there is a big part of positioning with this horse, and a lot of sources make it very, very clear that an agile person on foot can be more nimble than a horse in a best case scenario. That being said, I might be wearing lots of armour, I might be not very fit, I might be a bit slow on my feet, or I might be injured. And this horseman might be fantastic at manoeuvring their horse and able to match me. So this is never a black and white categorical thing, but clearly if you're just the same as in fencing or any other type of martial art, any type of fighting at all, positioning and where I place myself in relation to this horseman is very, very important. Clearly, if I can get behind, then that's good for me, okay? But not directly behind the horse, because it's got some nice hooves that can come out at the back there. But in terms of his weapons, generally speaking, Zach, or the horseman, is less able to protect himself and fight against me if I can get behind him. But for the most part, he's going to be wanting to keep the horse's head and his weapons pointed towards me and track me and move around to keep me in front of him and on the side that he prefers to fight on. Okay, so one of the other themes we often find when looking at historical sources, whether it's treatises or whether it's accounts of things that actually happened in warfare, is often a person in trying to fight against someone else on a horse, whether they themselves are on a horse or whether they're on foot, is they'll try to compromise the horseman's ability to control their horse. Now obviously this can come in a couple of different ways. One of those could of course be attacking the horse, wounding the horse, or making the horse scared. We see some mention in 19th century sources of waving things in front of the horse's face to make it turn, or at least kind of shy away, or perhaps even rear. But so there's doing things to the horse, but then there's also doing things to the equipment, okay? And that very often involves the reins here and the person's hand, bridle hand, is that, would you call that?
Rein hand.
Rein hand. So attacking this arm, and so if we go to the English Civil War, for example, it was quite common for them to wear an extra length gauntlet on the left arm to protect that arm. They weren't using shields by this point, so to protect that arm from enemy cavalrymen chopping, basically. But equally, if a person's on foot with something like a poleaxe or a bill, then that might be a major target as well to try and wound that, hit the reins. Possibly even in some situations going for the stirrups and this kind of thing. So what are your views about that? Obviously you wouldn't want that to happen. How much would it compromise your ability to control the horse?
So in a perfect situation with a really well-trained rider and a really well-trained horse, you don't necessarily need the reins.
Mm-hmm.
There's been some great work done by Philip Leach in Australia, just riding from the seat and from the legs with neither hand on the reins.
Okay.
But warfare and combat is not a perfect situation. So anything that you can do to slow down your opponent, even if you don't actually, cut their hand off or anything like that, if there's anything you can do to reduce their ability to communicate with their horse, then that is going to give you an advantage over a completely human person. So it wouldn't win you the fight straight away, but it's going to give you that big advantage. In the same way, if you were fighting on foot and you managed to get a slash in at your opponent's leg and got a big cut in their leg, it might not win you the fight. It definitely, it probably wouldn't win it right there unless it's a really deep slash.
Unless it's an artery or something, but it might be one step towards finishing that engagement. And how? So I guess we should mention saddles as well. So this is a modern saddle. A medieval saddle would obviously be higher.
Absolutely.
And would be more secure, would keep you in more? Yes,
so it would have plates on the front and back which would protect the areas that your plate armour couldn't. One of the interesting things about this from my point of view as a 15th century reenactor is that Richard III's one of his wounds on his body actually seems to be in a gap in between where the saddle plates would be and where the cuirass goes to if you're standing up in your saddle, which you sometimes need to do.
So it's sort of on his inner thigh or groin?
It's from the rear of the
it's from behind.
Pelvis.
Oh, I see.
So it seems like someone got behind.
It could be a footman,
jabbed him in the buttock. And certainly with that, there is no way that I would be able to control this horse.
Really?
The leg is so important. Which is why side tassets and mail, and it's all really layered on a horse.
It may have been by chance, but it could have been deliberate, and it could show someone on foot, whether it was a knight who was fighting on foot, or whether it was a billman or whoever, maybe having some insight into this is how you really mess up a knight on horseback. You get up close to them. And also I would suggest, going back to the positioning point, that your weapons and you aside, from me on foot against this large muscular animal, this is actually one of the places I feel safer. Because I can't clearly being kicked front or back by it. I mean, I know that the horse can obviously suddenly wheel around and knock me over, but this is a place where I can actually feel like I can fight against you without that horse directly being able to attack me.
And that's I think very much why cavalry units really tend to try to stick together and ride knee to knee as much as possible.
Because to protect those flanks.
That protect your flanks.
Yeah.
And there is some evidence that says that you would stagger lances and swords.
Okay.
So that the lance can protect from a longer distance and the sword can protect from a shorter distance.
I mean, that's a little bit similar to Machiavelli's advice with mixing sword and shield men with pikemen in the late 15th century. So yeah, very interesting stuff. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the weapons that the horsemen might be using and how we've got different considerations about how they might threaten me. So the basic rule, and there are exceptions to this. This is not like a sort of pure how to definitely defeat a horseman every time, magic answer, magic solution for the problem at all. But the general observation is that a swordsman is most dangerous on this side. Okay, so generally speaking, if someone is wielding a sword at me, then they are the most able to defend and offend on their sword side. As I go round to this side, they're now reaching across their body. Obviously, they're still a threat. They can still hit me, they can still defend. You could even argue that actually defensively, in some ways, they may be better on this side because they've essentially got prime or a hanging guard. They can move all around on this side, even all the way round to the flanks of the horse. But nevertheless, the generally observed advice from numerous cavalry sources and descriptive accounts is that the swordsman is they've got the longest reach and they're the most risk on that side. So if I'm fighting on foot with whatever weapon, I mean, I'm just holding a warhammer here, but it could be any weapon at all, the general advice, whether it's a bayonet or if you've got a sword and shield or a warhammer or poleaxe or spear or whatever, is that if you can get on the mounted swordsman's left hand side, on their left hand side, then you have now got maximum reach and they have got a reduced reach. So that's the advice against a swordsman. Against a lance, it's the opposite. So much like with the sword, against the lance, obviously Zach can offend me over on this side. Okay. Equally, if he moves the lance over the horse's head, he can offend me on this side. I'm moving all the way around here. He can keep fighting me all the way around, even to the rear. Okay, he has to modify his position, and clearly not all positions are biomechanically the most effective or the strongest or give the longest reach or range. So generally speaking, the lance is most effective in front of the horse's head and for quite a long way around on the left hand side. So therefore, the general advice for the footman is to get onto the left hand side of the horse's head and to oppose the lance on this side. You'll notice now that Zach is opening up his body. So instead of being strong and in a triangle across the body, the lance is now opened up an open line into the center of the body. This means that this becomes proportionately a weaker lever and more easily manipulated by me. If I get round on this side, and you'll notice I now, for the most part, are going to switch to a left hand lead, it enables me to cross the lance quite easily and ride over the top of his lance. And it's very difficult for him to push against that because he's only using the muscles of his back to push out, instead of the very strong muscles you've got of your pectorals and even your arm muscles and inner deltoids to push inwards. So it's far weaker for him to push outwards against my weapon than it would be to push the other way. So a often quoted piece of advice to the footman, particularly in the 19th century with bayonets, for example, is to get on this side of them. Now indeed, whilst you can cross the weapon towards the horse and come over the top here, you could equally push the person even wider out to this direction here. And if you're able to come in close, potentially you can almost completely nullify and get their lance in hand. So by taking the lance this direction, because of the way it twists the horseman's body, you make them very mechanically weak. Not to say that they can't use the lance on that side, not to say that there aren't counters. Zach, for example, switched over to putting it underneath the other arm, and this is actually shown in Fury Delivery's treatise, and this is a counter. Okay, and there are always counters to anything. There is I won't say there's nothing, but there is almost nothing which doesn't have some form of counter. So there are things he can do, there are ways he can mitigate this risk, but the general advice for the footman against the lance is to get on this side. The general advice for the footman against the sword, or one-handed short weapon, is to get on that side. Okay, so another thing worth mentioning is that this is a very big, powerful animal, much stronger than me, and for the most part, there's nothing I can physically do, not without weapons anyway, against this horse. Okay, it can push me all over the place, it can run over me, it can kick me, it can bite me, it can just knock me over just by turning around. Okay, but that being said, there are bits of equipment on this horse which absolutely could be manipulated, could be grabbed, number one. Number two, there are bits of the human sitting on the horse and their weaponry that can be grabbed, and so we saw one of those there where I managed to get onto this side and I managed to manipulate the lance in such a way that I was able to command it. Now what's interesting is if you manage to grab particularly a pole weapon, which you can get a secure hard grip on more easily than you can against a sword, you have now essentially got hold of the person unless they drop their weapon. Okay, so if I'm now offending the person on horseback while pulling their lance, they can't do anything with their lance, and their best bet probably is to either try and use their horse against me, to steer it round, to bowl me over, to just knock me over or push into me or whatever, or to ride away and try and take me with them. So I imagine if you moved a bit that way and move the horse, it's whoop, yep. I tell you, that's quite interesting. You can't very easily hold on to that lance. Yeah, I suppose Zach runs the risk of maybe coming off his horse if I can manage to keep a good solid hold. But
that's why I ride with very long stirrups. Right,
okay. But it just demonstrates the fact that this horse to some extent has become Zach's lower body. Okay, it's become his legs. So he might be a weak human like me up there, but down here he's an incredibly strong, great big animal. So even if I grab onto some part of him, he can move the horse away and take me with him. That being said, that might still allow me enough time to get some stabs in somewhere that he doesn't want them going. Underneath the armour, back of the knee, underneath the armpit, if he's got an open face helmet, that sort of thing. So grabbing, and not just the weapon, okay? It could be grabbing any part of the person. It could be grabbing part of his armour, his cuisse, or part of his arm harness, for example, or his pauldron, or indeed his ankle, you know, his greave. Possibly even the reins, so controlling the reins myself, grabbing the reins up here, are something I could do. So say if the lance is pointed down at me and has been a threat, but I have managed to take that lance offline and come in close here, it could be at that point this lance is no longer a threat, I don't actually need to keep hold of it, that at this point I actually grab part of the horse's reins or other equipment and actually try and grab hold of that just to hold on for long enough that I can get some more stabs or blows in with whatever weapon I'm using. So grabbing the person, grabbing the weapon, grabbing the horse, that's absolutely something I could do, but don't forget that he always has the ability to either ram the horse into you or pull the horse away, or even just turn around on the spot. Okay, now to talk briefly about the weapons that the footman should use against a mounted man. So clearly there is a general preference for the longer the better against a horseman, because the further away you can engage the horse and the rider from, and also bear in mind that the horseman will often have a lance, so you need to, or you want to, match their reach as much as possible. That's not always possible, of course. So with a long spear, if we take an even longer one here, so if this is a typical thrusting spear, then obviously I can engage the rider at lance length, okay, on equal terms, and it also means that I can offend the horse from a long way away, from a distance where the horse isn't necessarily a direct threat to me. I can move offline and I can wound the horse and keep moving away from it and try and avoid that horse colliding with me and directly being used as a weapon against me. So reach is a generally good thing. That being said, if you're a soldier on a medieval battlefield, you're not always equipped with the longest spear or pike available to you. You might very often be equipped with a type of polearm that is better for close-in fighting against other infantry, and that's what you happen to have to face against the horseman. Now, there is a very nice technique in Fiore's treatise, which I've essentially already shown in this video, where the person with one of these spears, which he calls a giavarina, which roughly translates into spontoon. It's a cut and thrust spear with lugs on it. Essentially it moves offline while encountering the lance and stabs the person in the face. So assuming that the horseman is coming straight at you and you're ready for them in boar's tooth, as the lance comes in, you traverse off the line, stepping with the front foot out first and then the rear foot aligning. You cross their lance and you essentially let them ride onto your spear point. Okay. We should also mention that this type of spear is different from a typical spear in that it can cut as well. And as mentioned earlier, we should recognise that those cuts could be used against the horse, against the rider, probably less useful against the rider if they're fully armoured, and could be used against the reins and other equipment if needs be. So the shorter spear or partisan or bill or halberd might not have as much reach as a long spear or a pike, but it's got other things it can do. And we should also mention hooking. Okay, so a lot of you will be thinking at this point, you know, halberds and bills, one of their characteristic things is they have a spike on the back or a hook, okay, and a hook on the front in the case of a bill. And that hook absolutely can be used to actually hook the person's weapon and manipulate the person's weapon, but it can obviously also be used on the person's armour or on the person, like to pull them off the horse, or it can be used on the reins, or it can be used on the horse itself. So clearly those heavier and shorter pole weapons give you a greater variety of options at the cost of reach. Finally, we don't always have the pleasure of using a polearm. Now clearly a polearm is advantageous when you're dealing with a big foe like a beautiful big horse and an opponent sitting on it. But sometimes you might have something much shorter like a shield and a short weapon such as a sword or a warhammer or a mace or something like that. Now, there is a little bit of advice in Marozzo from 1536 which we can use in this case, and it's Marozzo is one of the authors that actually champions the cause of the footman versus the mounted man. And one of the things, if we look at the Bolognese sources that we can do and that we recognise, is that when someone's fighting us mounted, he can't offend my lower half, okay? He can only really reach my top half, whereas I can reach all of him. So although he's in an elevated position and that might seem advantageous, in actual fact I can hit him anywhere from the foot to the head. I can reach Zach's head just about, it's a little bit far away from me, but I can easily reach his bottom half. And it's actually not that easy for him to defend his bottom half. I, on the other hand, only have to worry about defending my top half. So what's interesting is that whether this person has got a lance or a sword, if I come across to a side of them that which seems advantageous at the time, or just whichever side I end up on, if I'm coming around here, I have the ability to cover my head with my shield at the same time as offending the person or the horse underneath while covering myself from them. So actually, although very short reach weapons might seem like a big disadvantage, and I would say overall they are, if you have a shield, that kind of helps balance out a bit, and it helps you to basically protect the only part of your body that's vulnerable to the horseman. The only exception would be a lance. If you bring the lance down level at me, if that lance is levelled at me, this is potentially now, this is obviously a shortened version of a lance, it would have be a lot longer than this. This potentially could hit me anywhere from the legs up through the groin up to the head. So in that case, that becomes more like facing any other opponent with a spear, okay? Except that this person can now move explosively forwards with a lot of energy from that horse, they can collide into me with that horse and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, if I can come in close to that person, then they can't wound me in the lower regions, but I can still wound them, and I can cover my vulnerable parts with the shield. Okay, the final piece of advice for the footman against the mounted man. actually comes from 19th century sources, so whether you want to accept this for medieval weapons and medieval techniques is up to you, but we've certainly got it there in 19th century sources. Now, if you've looked at the use of the bayonet against the mounted lancer, and this was done a lot in tournaments in the 19th century, for example the famous Royal Tournament held in London, and very often they would have a lance like this with a padded head. We'd both have fencing masks and padded jackets and padded gloves on and leg protection. And he was literally trying to hit me, and I was on foot with the bayonet, literally trying to hit him. I wasn't allowed to hit the horse in the tournament situation. Obviously in real warfare you would. But in any case, whether I'm aiming for the man or the horse, it follows very much the rules that we've talked about previously here. I'm trying to keep that point away from me, I'm trying to find an advantageous bind, and then I'm trying to offend him. On paper, his weapon looks longer than mine, and it is in literal terms a longer weapon. So how do I overcome that? How do I get the reach? Well, what we see in 19th century sources is this. Okay, which is essentially lancing the long heavy weapon out one-handed to hit the person on horseback. So essentially it's a one-handed lunge with the long weapon. So that what's usually a two-handed weapon, and you could do this absolutely with a poleaxe or a glaive, and it was done with bayonets, lancing the thing out one-handed momentarily to hit the person on horseback and then bringing it back in. So you're really just looking to knock their weapon off the side, get that opening, nail them quickly, and then get back to your two-handed guard again. And obviously you could apply this thrust to the horse as well rather than the rider.
And one of the things to remember in the medieval period as well is that that might not do too well against a fully armoured knight.
Absolutely.
That wasn't the only type of cavalry on the battlefield.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's something that could have happened against certain opponents.
Yeah,
in
so
certain situations.
in a 19th century context, an unarmoured cavalryman with a bayonet, it would go straight through them. But yeah, if they've got a cuirass on, doesn't even need to be full armour, but if their torso is covered with even a brigandine, then it very likely won't go through. But if they've got an open face helmet and you can get them in the face, then that's all good.
If they're just wearing riding boots.
And even if it's just a percussive blow, so if you're using something like a poleaxe or a halberd and you hit them hard enough that it knocks them, then that might have a beneficial effect for you as well. So hereby ends the advice for the footman against the mounted man within a medieval context, and obviously drawing upon 19th century and other sources as well, both treatise, manual and descriptive accounts also. I just want to thank Zachary Evans hugely for taking part in this video. He will, just to remind you, have a second part following this up, which will look at the advice for the horseman against the infantryman. So you will get to see it from the other side. Obviously, some of the similar issues will be touched on there as well. I want to thank Gary as well for his assistance with the beautiful horse Indy, and I want to thank Indy the horse, who is just, I fell a bit in love with him. He's absolutely one of the nicest horses I've ever met. Lovely, lovely horse. It was a great pleasure to do this with Zach, and I will be doing further things with Zach in the future. So if you've got specific requests or things you want us to look at, just to remind you, comment underneath. And do make sure that you kind of put your ideas for future videos, but also perhaps feedback on this one as well. Obviously this was a general overview, something I personally would like to look at with Zach in the future. There's some of the specific techniques shown in treatises, both for horseman against another horseman, but also foot against horse. As mentioned in this video, there is a very specific couple of techniques in Fiore de Liberi's treatise for the footman against the mounted man, and there is also a very specific set of advice given by Marozzo in his Opera Nova, which is actually more complex than what we've showed in this video, and I'd like to look at that probably as a standalone video at some point as well. So I hope you enjoyed watching this. Sorry for the wind noise, nothing much we could do about that. Hopefully you could catch most of what we were both saying. I hope you've enjoyed it, and be sure to check out Zach's video when it comes out. There's a link below to Zach's channel. Go and give him a subscribe and check out some of his videos now, and I'll see you back again on this channel really soon for another video. Cheers folks!